And welcome to the Society of Outdoor Recreation Professionals webinar on collaboration and public participation in outdoor recreation planning, emerging design, and strategy. My name is Sergio Capozzi, and I'm the current president of SORP. For those of you who are not currently SORP members, SORP is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's been around since 1983. We originally got our start as a group made up of SCORP planners dedicated to SCORP planning. Over time, and as our membership grew and diversified, our core mission has expanded to be more encompassing of the entire outdoor recreation profession. Today, our members include federal, state, and local agency staff, academics, nonprofits, and private consultants engaged in outdoor recreation planning, management, policy development, and research. If you aren't a member, I would highly encourage you to learn more about SORP via our website and consider joining. Before we jump into the webinar here today, I wanted to make everyone aware of a couple of features we plan to use today to help keep everyone engaged during the presentation. During the webinar, we will post several polls or questions that will appear on your control panel and would appreciate your responses. I'm about to launch the first one now. So hopefully you can all see that over on your control panel. Your responses will help guide some of the information that is presented today, so we highly encourage you to help out there and answer those questions. Secondly, we do plan to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. You can ask a question at any time by using the question pane on the control panel. So again, questions generally won't be answered until the end. I'll do my best to make sure questions that are posed through the question pane are shared with our presenters during the Q&A session. I seem to have just lost my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. I'm very excited you've chosen to participate in today's collaboration and public participation webinar. This is actually the second webinar in a series that closely aligns with the forthcoming Best Practices in Outdoor Recreation Planning book that is being published by Sagamore Publishing later this year. Scott Babcock, SORP's Secretary and current Chair of the Education and Professional Development Committee, in cooperation with the book's authors, John Boss and Robert Burns, has been instrumental in helping organize these webinars. I hope you'll be able to join us for our future webinars and consider picking up a copy of the book when it's available. Please be aware that this presentation is being recorded. The PowerPoint will be posted on our website, and the recorded version of the webinar will be posted on YouTube in the future. Also, keep in mind that our speakers are participating from locations across the country, and while we don't anticipate any technological glitches, you never know what may happen. So we ask for your patience in advance. Earlier I mentioned the polls that we'll be using during today's webinar, and I'm happy to report here the results of our first question. Realize that some people may already be taking these. We've got about 86% of you have voted at this point. Real diverse group of folks here today. It's about 30% work for a federal agency, 29% a local government agency, 24% with a state agency. We've got 8% that are in the private sector and 9% that are affiliated with a nonprofit. That's great. Real diverse group here. It is my pleasure to now provide a brief introduction on our two amazing webinar presenters today, Steve Saline and Cindy Mendoza. Steve Saline is a professor in the Recreation, Parks, and Tourism Resources program at West Virginia University. He has spent the past 20 years working domestically and abroad, helping regions, agencies, and communities to implement more collaborative approaches to strategic planning. He has contributed to strategic planning for heritage areas, national forests, community revitalization efforts, state forest stewardship, regional land use, watershed management, regional tourism marketing, and cross-border protected area management. Dr. Saline has presented and published in a variety of professional and scientific outlets and is currently working on multiple public engagement efforts. Cindy Mendoza is a project manager with MIG, specializing in comprehensive strategic and master planning for parks, recreation facilities, natural areas, and trails. For more than 20 years, she has helped agencies throughout the West engage residents and stakeholders in planning and designing park and recreation systems. She routinely applies a variety of outreach techniques to her projects to bring the right people to the table, identify community priorities, build consensus, and create support for plan implementation. Ms. Mendoza's background in geography, recreation, and environmental studies allows her to integrate and assess environmental factors, recreation trends, community preferences, and sociocultural needs in recreation resource planning. She has also presented at multiple conferences and published articles in several journals and magazines. And I should mention that Steve and Cindy collaborated on a chapter of the Best Practices in Outdoor Recreation Planning book. So I'm very excited to have them here today to talk more about their work and experience with collaboration and public participation. And with that, I'll turn things over to Steve and Cindy.
All right, well, welcome everyone to our amazing webinar today. We certainly hope you enjoy being part of our online learning community, and also that you find the format and content useful to your own planning efforts today. We've got a four-part format planned for this workshop today. First, we'll be providing a little bit of background on how collaboration and public participation contributes to outdoor recreation planning. Next, we'll be discussing different strategies for managing the collaborative process. We'll conclude our formal part of the webinar with 3 different planning case studies, and that should leave us plenty of time for some Q&A towards the end of the webinar. And always, as we move through the webinar, we really encourage your questions and insights into public participation programs.
So to make sure we're all on the same page, we wanted to start the presentation by defining some key terms. In the context of NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, collaboration is when one agency solicits input from other agencies and/or a balanced set of interested parties. Since I'm a practitioner, I want to clarify that really, that's NEPA. In the real world, especially if your planning effort is remotely controversial, the affected and interested parties might seem a little bit unbalanced. And that's not a commentary on their mental status. It's simply that the people who want to be involved, you end up with a variety of different groups and different sizes who all want in some way to influence the outcome of your project. So what you need to do is to be strategic in getting broad-based input and support for your planning process. So not sure what happened here in terms of technical glitches, but I'm seeing a blank screen at this point. So collaboration and participation, just briefly in the context that we'll use them here, focuses on the fact that collaboration is really working together with key people and groups to make decisions. So it's shared decision making. Public participation is more so the process of engaging stakeholders, residents, visitors, and others to participate at different levels in the planning effort. And I want to clarify that when we talk about outdoor recreation planning, we're recognizing that many of you are involved in site master planning and design, whether others may be involved in long-range and strategic planning, visioning, or even natural resource planning. We're going to talk a bit about public participation and collaboration and the fact that it has been increasing dramatically in the planning process. In fact, we ended up with many people so interested that we doubled the number of people we anticipated would be participating in this webinar, which is fantastic. But we need to understand a bit about why this is happening and why there's such an increased need for knowledge around public participation. To answer that question, I'm going to frame the discussion in terms of the top 5 reasons to engage residents, stakeholders, and other agencies in the planning process. And the first reason, matter-of-factly, is that you have to engage people. There are federal, state, and sometimes even now local mandates that require a minimum level of public participation. As you see on the slide here, there are NEPA requirements. There are very specific SEPA requirements. There's an example here from the city of Longmont, Colorado, who now has their own public engagement manual called Engaging Citizens, so that every planning process done in that town needs to correspond with specific outreach strategies. You need to ask yourself as you're embarking on your planning process, is the bare minimum enough to gain the support you need for your project? There are these requirements, but there are also a number of agencies that provide guidance who can help you expand your planning process. One of those is the National Park Service, who has a website devoted to civic engagement. There are many others that provide good resources for you to use in terms of understanding how to broaden the process. In fact, one of those resources is the Federal Highway Administration. They have a public involvement page as well on the website. And the question you may be asking is, why do recreation planners care about the Federal Highway Administration? The thing you need to know is that depending on the types of projects you're doing, requirements come from all directions. So for example, trails funding has come from both Safety Lou and now MAP 21 transportation funding packages. And so you need to be aware that your process, if it's trail related and you're anticipating that as a funding resource, needs to incorporate some of the best practices from the Federal Highway Administration. And I really like the way they call out the fact that public participation is more than just a hearing. It's not just one meeting at the end of the project. You really need to know more so about community values to make sure you are minimizing and mitigating impacts from your project. And you also need to help the community understand constraints and trade-offs in order to get their buy-in and support for the plan. The next reason to engage in outreach and collaboration is really because you have to. Recession's been a huge driving economic consideration for planning, affecting not only the staffing that agencies have as well as the budgets that they have for planning. So there needs to be a strong focus not only on keeping costs down for your planning effort, but also focusing on the long-term return on investment. In other words, you want to make sure that your plan is successful and adopted, because you don't have time to go back and revise your planning effort based on comments received at the end of the project. Or you don't have time to worry about the fact that you may not have voter support if you haven't done due diligence throughout the project to make sure the public is on board. And beyond that, you may find yourself in a situation where you need to rely on other agencies to share the costs of your planning effort to make sure you can go forward and engaging the right community support for the process, but as well as answering the questions that you need. In addition to that, we live in an information age. I think all of us are aware of the changes in technology, changes in the way we receive info, as well as the way we provide information. Social media, online mapping, and a variety of other online survey forums are changing the way that people expect to contribute to the planning process and be informed about the planning process. And this is also leading into changes in the way that people want to be involved throughout the planning process. There's really a key trend of increasing involvement in both planning and implementation, increase in volunteerism, for example, but also a sense that now everyone is an expert, and that there are trends such as crowdsourcing that lets us know that we can make use of innovative ways to engage people in supporting projects and the ideas that they value. There's a sense that we can all work together using technology innovation and the level of engagement people expect to have in order to help move our projects forward. And the final reason, and what some of you may think is the most important reason, is that you want to make sure that you have support and not angry residents at the end of your project. Americans feel we have a right to determine what happens on our property, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And frankly, there's a lot of distrust of government agencies as well as outside planners. So we need to accept the fact that we have to be transparent. We need to avoid what appears like a hidden agenda, and there's a minor reference there to Agenda 21, which is thwarting a lot of planning efforts. We need to let people know that they have an important voice in the planning process, but more than that, that they can also influence the outcome of the planning process.
Well, no participation webinar would be worth its salt if it didn't acknowledge the work of the International Association for Public Participation, particularly their participation spectrum. It's emerged as an important contribution to public participation planning internationally. So basically, this framework just shows how your goals and public participation methods should vary depending upon the level of participation that you desire in the planning process. So at the low end of the participation spectrum, your goal might just be to inform the public and provide them with objective information to assist them in decision making. The methods there, might be as simple as public service announcements or web posts. But most agencies, communities aspire to more of a collaborative relationship with their various publics. So as you move up that spectrum, the goal with a collaborative relationship would be to really partner with the public at each stage of the planning process, and working with various methods such as working groups, action teams, advisory committees. Okay, well, Cindy and I might be a little bit biased about this, but certainly we feel like there are many benefits that can come from involving the public in the planning process. We've tried to capture some of these in this table, but basically the first column we term process benefits. A lot of these are more intangible things, and maybe a little bit harder to measure, but still are very important benefits from engaging the public. The benefits of mutual learning, building trust, and building momentum for the project. The outcome benefits, a little bit more long-term benefits. Certainly, this is really the bottom line, helping you to get projects done and building better decisions that stick over the long term. Okay, well, certainly public engagement programs aren't a panacea, and they're not meant for every kind of decision. But many studies have confirmed that there are a number of factors that tend to facilitate your participation in collaboration programs being successful. So, certainly when there's support from the top of your agency, collaborative processes are going to be a lot more successful. Number two, sufficient room to make meaningful decisions. It's been my experience that participants can smell out pretty quickly if collaboration is just an exercise, and then the agency goes ahead and makes the decision they're going to make in the first place. It doesn't take too long for constituents to figure that out. So, these are situations that tend to support collaborative processes. Back one year. So certainly there's certain circumstances where collaboration isn't the best strategy. Certainly when you have emergency decisions, highly technical decisions, obviously emergency response during Hurricane Sandy, you're probably not going to take the time there to promote a collaborative process. So, there are many situations where collaboration and a high degree of participation just isn't appropriate.
All right, I'm going to jump in here right now. We're actually going to launch our second poll question. We're interested to see what type of planning you all are commonly involved in. So hopefully you all see this new poll that I just posted, and you can take that here. I'll give you guys a second to respond, and we'll see where the results shake out. This is pretty interesting to be on my end and get to watch the different tallies here and see how many of you have voted. One of the benefits, I guess, of being an organizer here, get these instantaneous results. Right now it looks like the majority of folks, and again, you could answer multiple types of planning here. Top one being the site designs and master plans here. Looks about 85% of participants today, you guys are involved in those. About 68% are involved in long-range or strategic plans. 34% typically do NEPA plans, and then 24% other. So very good, again, a good diversity, the type of planning that's going on with our participants today.
So the type of planning that's being done obviously affects your project scope, your time frame, the resources you have available, not only amount of funding, but staffing, technology, and all of those things are going to drive how you set up your community engagement strategy. So this slide provides a quick overview of the steps you need to consider in putting together an engagement plan, from the start where you're identifying those resources to the end where you're reporting back the results that are found through the process, so that again the public and the partners that you have know that they are being heard. But one of the most important points is that people should be involved in all phases of your planning effort. It's not that they're involved at the end after a decision is made and you're just getting commentary or testimony on what's been decided. But again, you need to go beyond that bare minimum and make sure that you are getting feedback up front, involving people in making decisions and identifying trade-offs in terms of the alternatives that go forward. And finally, that, again, you have their final buy-off in the end. And the reason this is important is because even though we all work really hard to use our resources to create strong engagement and outreach strategies, we still often hear typical comments at the end such as these: "No one ever talked to me," or "Only advocates and supporters were involved in the planning process," or, as Steve just mentioned, "Planners only asked me what I thought after they had already made a decision." Because of those comments, we really need to think about details such as notification. How are we reaching out to people to make sure everyone knows what's going on and can be involved if they want to? What's our outreach strategy? Who should be involved, but what are the best tools to use in reaching them? And timing is always an issue. When are people involved, and can they influence the outcome of the planning process? You know, most projects that go forward, they usually have a report back to a board, a council, or a commission, but often they also have some type of project advisory committee made up of those key people who are going to help you keep moving the project forward. It might have some type of public meeting or open house. You might give people 3 minutes to provide testimony on a presentation, or use display boards and a comment card so they can comment on findings that are being presented. You may have some type of website available to keep people informed of the planning process. Maybe it just provides information, but maybe it's used to, support an online survey or collect feedback. But what's interesting is if you go back to that IAP2 framework that Steve had set up, it looks like that's not coming up. There we go. It looks like what really happens is that the only people that are truly involved in collaborating in the planning process are those key staff, the agencies, the advocates, those people who you know are your friends and allies who are going to help the project move forward. And that's good, but what that does is it creates that common complaint from the community that decisions were already made before we had a chance to comment, or the only people who are truly involved are those who are in favor of the project. And so we need to make sure that there are some other types of activities that are added to that bare minimum to make sure that people have an opportunity to be involved and to collaborate in the planning process. You always know your results are going to be better if you get feedback from a variety of different people, but often agencies find themselves pretty insulated. They know who the key people are to work with, they know who the other agencies are that they often partner or collaborate with, but they don't know how to reach people beyond the usual suspects of people who typically show up at meetings. So an example is that you may want to announce a meeting to discuss the possible expansion of camping opportunities in the region. And depending on how you word that announcement, you're most likely to get attendees who are already interested in camping. You're not going to get the people who are not interested. You may get more local people, depending on how your meeting is structured, and the point is you don't necessarily then get feedback from other visitors who are more likely to use campgrounds as a resource. So there's a geographic consideration in the populations you're reaching out to. You also may find that your advertisement won't even touch those underrepresented groups, who are the people who are unlikely to attend meetings. Some of them may not even have a computer if you're providing your web information, for example. Maybe they speak a different language. Maybe they're just have a general distrust of the government. And depending on how you set up your process, you're not going to reach out to those populations. So you need to think very broadly about who your target audiences are, and then what is the best tool to make sure that they're involved. The point of this slide is simply to show you that there's a different level of influence that different stakeholders and groups are going to have on your planning process, and a different level of engagement or interest that they have in being involved. So you need to be sure you're using a variety of tools to keep people involved through the process. We can't talk today about all the different outreach techniques that you can possibly use, so I want to focus today really on meetings and how you can think differently about meetings, for example, to broaden your planning process and get better feedback. And one way to start is to think a bit differently about your advisory group. Often we involve, again, the steering committee is composed of people that we know are going to support the planning process. There's a technical committee of experts. But sometimes we're not looking more broadly at community and citizen groups who can help inform the process, or even who that implementation team is. Who are those businesses, volunteer groups, and community leaders who are going to move the process forward? But more than that, I want to figure out how we can involve those people who we know are going to oppose your planning process. So, for example, if you know the Sierra Club has a tendency to file a lawsuit over outdoor recreation plans in your area, then give them a seat up front at the table. And I've heard a lot of people comment, well, they're unreasonable. We don't necessarily want to give them a voice in the process. But the point is, they're going to have a voice, whether you like it or not, whether it's at the beginning or the end. And you prefer to give them a voice to help influence the outcome, to get them on board and supporting, rather to wait till the end when you have a lawsuit or people speaking out to try to obstruct implementation. So in terms of meetings with the public, it's also important to think a bit about outside the box in terms of the traditional meeting with a presentation and public testimony, or the display boards followed by the comment cards. Think of different ways to get people more involved, whether it's a walking tour. I know there's a lot of people on the presentation from Metro Parks Tacoma, and one of my favorite tours they gave was a tour of the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of their park system. So they showed people how they were prioritizing spending of resources. They showed people how there are sites that definitely need improvements, and they let people understand some of the choices and trade-offs that they needed to make in order to advance and improve their park and recreation system. And that kind of tour, where people were out in the fields seeing what was going on and talking to key staff, really led to the help, the support that they needed to pass a bond measure to start improving their park system. Another example is what we call do-it-yourself meetings, where you create an outreach kit that either a speakers bureau or just even different neighbors can take out to either formal groups or informal groups, so they can talk amongst themselves and report the feedback to you about what they're thinking about your planning process. Beyond that, there are also opportunities to make sure that people are more engaged. And for some reason, this slide is not advancing. So one of the ways to make sure people are more involved and engaged is simply to make the meetings more interactive and fun. Don't just inform people and consult or take comments back. Actually get them involved, such as a trade-offs game where you present an opportunity to make decisions. Tell them what options are for capital projects to advance. Tell them what maintenance costs will be. Give them a budget and ask them to sort out what their priorities will be. Gives you great feedback on how you want to move forward. Also, involving technology such as the use of audience response polling allows you to ask questions, and sort of like we're doing here with our online polls, getting instant feedback so we know what your perspective is and also what's important to you. Also, one other thing to consider is we often host meetings and we expect people to come to our meetings. What about changing that process and instead going to where the people are? One of the ways of doing this is what we call an intercept event. You know, it may be a trail survey where you're standing at the edge of the trail asking them about their opinions, or it can be going to a community festival or a community event where you have a booth set up and can collect feedback that way, or simply meeting people out at the project site, or as we all know, online forums are a great way to get people involved without having them actually physically having to come to and attend a meeting. There's a variety of different methods and notification strategies. There was a past webinar specifically devoted to statistically valid surveys and online questionnaires. But what I want you to focus on is just as important in selecting the right outreach tool is the notification strategy. How do you let people know there's an online questionnaire or a meeting available? You need to make sure that your outreach notification strategy is as varied and broad as the types of tools that you use. And finally, there's a variety of different factors to consider when you create your outreach strategy, and that is the feedback that you receive for outdoor recreation in particular often varies, whether you're talking about a winter activity or a summer activity, whether you're talking to people during peak or non-peak use hours. When you're looking at youth versus seniors, and a variety of factors, including different recreation versus competitive skill levels for recreation enthusiasts. You really need to make sure that you are broadening who you're reaching to get the best feedback. And finally, I wanted to note that your goal is definitely to increase awareness in your planning process, to increase participation and support for your plan. But in the long term, part of our overall goal is to really increase the long-term involvement of as many people as possible in outdoor recreation, hopefully helping them in that transition to becoming a steward or an advocate for taking care of our outdoor recreation and our natural resources. And so that's really an important component of this planning process, is developing those long-term constituents. And finally, it's also important to let people know that they've been heard, to post results, but also to keep in mind as you're sharing those results that if you're only talking to one person or a small group of people, the results tend to be fairly anecdotal. You can't assume that everybody in the entire community thinks that way. If you look at the illustration on the left, it was actually a youth forum that we held where we were asking what they wanted to have in their park. If you go down the list, it's really interesting that this person wanted wild animals available right next to their water slides and go-karts. We've talked about national forest areas, and we get feedback that it would be a great place for an amusement park, for example. So clearly the results that you get don't necessarily summarize what the entire community thinks as a whole. So that is another reason why you need to make sure that your outreach is very broad-based.
Excellent. And before Steve and Cindy jump into some case studies here, we're going to launch our last poll, launching that now. So please feel free to take that regarding your biggest challenges in collaboration and public participation. So if you could go ahead and take that now. We are getting a few responses for mobs with pitchforks. That's probably unfortunate. All right, here we go. Apathy right now is out front. Does seem to be getting the most votes here. Getting critical mass. Apathy still on top. So 49 to 50% here. Apathy seems to be one of the biggest challenges y'all face. 18% said other. Be interesting to find out what those other things are. 15% apparently of you have encountered mobs with pitchforks. Again, that's probably unfortunate. 9% bad press and 8% lawsuits. So thank you again for that, and hopefully here as we get into the case studies, we'll find out about some of the other challenges and how to overcome some of these challenges.
Okay, well, we've got 3 case studies planned for you for this afternoon. The first one is a program, a collaborative program, pretty close to my backyard in Morgantown, West Virginia. It's called the Monongahela Rivertown Program. The Rivertown program was patterned after a very successful Trails Town program along the Great Allegheny Passage bicycle route, the old Western Maryland rail line that runs from Pittsburgh to Cumberland, Maryland. But this program is capitalizing on the Monongahela River as a shared recreational asset. It is definitely a cooperative economic development and marketing initiative. I wanted to acknowledge the program sponsors. This program is partially supported by the Benedum Foundation and the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, and a consulting firm called the McCollum Development Strategies, of which Kathy McCollum is the principal of that consulting firm. The vision of the Rivertown program is to build a network of vibrant river towns that offer visitor amenities and services to the public, trying to get communities to more actively engage with the river and with each other. The program today, it's a very practical program. It's a regional planning approach to community development. It's building on the assets that the community already brings to the table. And I mentioned it's a very practical project, identifying short, mid, and long-term projects. Real practical projects, public events, river festivals, public art, trails, parks, wayfaring signs, and branding initiative is very, very, very popular. We have a saying with the Rivertown program: we're not planning more work, but we're working the plan. And so that really emphasizes the practical nature of the project. The collaborative planning elements of the program are here. It starts with an asset mapping exercise. Again, this is all a participatory planning with very active public participation throughout. There's a needs assessment part of the project, but very quickly in the process we organize action teams that identify local projects and regional projects and work on implementing those projects. Each community is assigned a Student Conservation Association intern, and they work with the community as well. The goal of the overall program, of course, is community sustainability and program sustainability. But finally, the goal of the project is to add capacity to local efforts, and this is primarily in the areas of fundraising, public participation, and marketing.
So for our second case study, we wanted to switch gears a bit. Different side of the country, Island County, Washington. A few years ago, they began putting together a recreation and habitat conservation plan. They needed to do so to meet the Growth Management Act requirements. It was the county was in the process of updating their comprehensive plan, but also they were looking to apply for grant funding through the Land and Water Conservation Fund to see if they could acquire and protect some more critical natural resources in the county. What's interesting is that Island County is composed of two different islands, so Whidbey and Camano Island and Puget Sound area west of Seattle. So inherently, a county of that sort, especially when the two counties are not connected directly by any ferry or by any bridge, makes it interesting and challenging to get the entire community involved in the planning process as well as on board with its results. Another challenge that the county faced, and this is inherently why I picked this as a case study, is that they had more than 3,300 acres of parks and habitat conservation areas, but they've been really hit hard by the recession. If you all know anything about the cost of managing and maintaining acreage of that size, recognize that their budget was cut to $260,000 annually. which meant they had about 2 maintenance staff to take care of over 3,000 acres. So they were really hit hard in terms of budget. They didn't know how they were going to possibly take care of the resources they had, let alone meet community demands to add more conservation areas. So they were looking at the plan as an opportunity to address many of those questions, looking at keeping the plan low budget because they didn't have a lot of funds, but recognizing that community outreach was going to be critical in answering the questions that they had. So the first thing they did is recognize that the Whidbey Camano Land Trust, a trust nonprofit there in the area, was one of the key partners in terms of acquiring sites that they then would hand off to the county to manage. So from the get-go, they started a collaborative process involving them as a partner and joint funder of the project in order to move it forward. But beyond that, they started recognizing that they weren't the only provider of recreation opportunities in the area. So clearly from the get-go, they had to collaborate to ensure that they weren't duplicating efforts with other providers, but also to share, identified best practices throughout the county on how to take care of the resources that were there. And that involved working with the National Park Service, state parks, the Department of Wildlife, 3 towns and cities, school districts, 2 park and recreation districts. There were private recreation providers, as well as things like port authorities, all who had a stake in this planning process. I already indicated that collaboration was needed because of the jurisdictions involved and because of the lack of project funding. But also, again, they really had a strong need to understand community priorities because they could no longer afford to do everything that they had done in the past. Beyond that, they wanted to see if the community would be willing to pay through a bond measure or perhaps a levy additional funds or taxes to help take care of the park and recreation assets that they had, including the natural resources where they needed to take care and manage those to avoid invasive species, take care of stormwater quality, water quality in general, and the like. And so what was really interesting is that throughout the early feedback that we received, it became very clear that people in the county were all struggling financially, and they weren't interested in additional bonds or taxes. You see a questionnaire question down in the bottom right-hand corner that noted that 74% of people felt that volunteer efforts or 62% nonprofit efforts were the best bet in terms of developing and maintaining future parks and habitat conservation areas. So one of the key things about this process is very quickly the county realized that outreach became an important way to identify people and groups who would be willing to volunteer and support resource management in the future. In looking at those challenges and in looking at the different types of outreach that were needed, they conducted some very targeted outreach. They involved stakeholders in these stakeholder interviews. These were those collaborative partners, the Park Service, state parks, and on down, that they knew they needed to talk to one-on-one to make sure that they really were understanding what the key issues were. In some cases, they couldn't talk to all of them one-on-one, so they met as small groups, again, to get a good sense of the issues at hand before they went forward in identifying recommendations or alternatives. They also met with a couple of different focus groups, one held on each of the 2 islands, people who very specifically wanted to be involved in influencing the outcome of the project. Beyond that, there was a web questionnaire so that anyone who wanted to comment could be involved. And there was notifications sent out so not only locals could comment to the web questionnaire, but also the visitors. They come to the island for all the different tourism resources that are there. And in particular, being west of Seattle, Island County is a great place to escape from the city for a while. So it was important to address the needs of both locals as well as the tourists who were showing up. And then finally, there were some targeted community intercept events on each island, looking at existing events such as farmers markets and festivals, and where those weren't available at the right time, even standing in front of a grocery store over on Camano Island to say, what's really important to you. And in a couple of months, and with those targeted efforts, more than 950 people participated. There were 15 different agencies and jurisdictions involved, and that really didn't include the people that also showed up at the board presentations and meetings. So again, switching gears to show you different opportunities for public outreach and involvement, I wanted to highlight a project with regards to the West Side Regional Trail, which is a trail that's been planned by the Portland Metro. It's a regional planning organization here in Portland, Oregon. And what's really interesting about this case study is that this trail has been planned through Trails Plans, oh goodness, I think at least since 2003. So it's not that suddenly this new idea was launched on the community. It's been part of long-range and strategic plans, but they were at the point where they wanted to move it forward. So this planning process was a more specific master plan to identify the right trail alignment for the future. The trail that's proposed is a 25-mile trail stretching from the Tualatin River in the south clear to the Willamette River. So it passes through not only Portland, but the city of Beaverton, Tigard, King City, and passes through many, many different neighborhoods and communities as it winds its way in part along a power line corridor in the area. The trail process then, because it affected so many different communities, needed to have a variety of different outreach techniques applied. And this included meeting with different committees and setting up committees to have those meetings, meeting with different homeowners associations, attending and setting up public open houses, website forum, questionnaire available both online and in a paper format for those people who didn't have computer access, flyers that went out, newsletters, e-blasts, as I'm reading down this list, including a full press response to try to get a message out in the press. And I hope you guys are paying attention, because what you need to realize, and why I picked this case study, are those were the outreach techniques that were applied by the opposition group to this trail. That there was a group of neighbors who were really, really upset that the trail was proposed to go through their neighborhood, where they had their own green space and their own smaller trail corridor that they didn't want connected to the regional trail. So they had set up their own website. They had a survey available via SurveyMonkey. They created their own paper questionnaire. All those techniques, again, were things that they used to influence the messaging around this trail project to try to, I don't know, convince people that the trail was a bad idea, or at least to move it away from their neighborhood, to say there are other trails that have been proposed as well. This is an unnecessary duplication of resources. It's going to be too costly. A lot of messaging. Why could they do this? Again, we live in an information age. It was very easy for them to quickly generate some momentum around the messages they were trying to convey. And what are those messages? Well, it's interesting that a flyer that was produced that gave people talking points on what to say when they showed up at the trail open houses, that's too small to read, so I want to highlight a couple of things. So specifically, this flyer was targeted to their own neighborhood. They wanted to let you know that the trail, if built, would be a flood of non-residents into a private green space. I love the fast bike commuters that fly by kids during their walk to school, losing control, cars clogging the streets, portable toilets everywhere. So obviously the message is a little bit different than Portland Metro would have conveyed. They even had tips to show your opposition to the trail. And this amuses me entirely. Please be courteous and professional, because planners see angry people all the time, and we just ignore them. Or better yet, don't complain about things like crime, graffiti, and litter, because trail people and planners don't believe those things occur, and they don't care anyway. So obviously, again, messaging very different. Techniques are the same. So in this case, and you can see why I picked this example, the key point is that outreach was needed by Portland Metro, not only to unite the different jurisdictions to identify a best trail alignment and to identify public support, but really to counter some misinformation that was out there. And when Portland Metro went on the initiative to make sure that their messages were being heard, it was very easy to point out that some of the messages created by the Oak Hills neighbors were a little inaccurate about the trail and how it was going to be built and managed. In fact, Portland Metro made sure that they had a full advisory committee member of all the different people involved, as you can see there on the right. It was a little stacked in terms of people who are in favor of the trail, but again, it's typical to want to include those advisory committee members or who would help move the project forward. They also had their own website set up where people could get information. They had a few different open houses, one on the north end of the trail, one on the south end of the trail at 2 different times during the planning process. And what they found overall is that 200 people attended those open houses, and 250 people weighed in on their online forum. They had an online survey that was available. And so really, in terms of outreach in a Portland metropolitan region, there wasn't a lot of people who participated in their outreach techniques, but more people were aware of the planning process, again, in part because of the outreach techniques used by the opposition. So right there is a very good reason why you need to make sure that you're getting your messaging out, and also identifying the sheer numbers of people that you could involve in the planning process and figure out how best to get them involved. Because as they found out here, sometimes the bare minimum for public outreach and involvement is not enough.
Well, great. Well, thanks everybody for participating in our webinar this afternoon. I thought it was particularly interesting that public apathy emerged as a major challenge to folks' planning efforts. So, certainly that's one of the major goals of our public participation efforts, is to build a stronger constituency for our planning efforts and for the agencies that we work for. But certainly, there's no silver bullet. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to public participation programs. It's more of a matter of tailoring our methods to the needs of the situation. So I guess Cindy and I wanted to thank you all, and also want to encourage you all to continue to look for ways to share best practices and lesson learned about your public participation methods. So thanks again for all of us.
Great, thanks Steve and Cindy. And we do have some time now for questions. We did have some that came in while the presentation was taking place, and I'll go over those now. If you do have questions for Cindy and Steve, please feel free to use the question pane on the control panel. Again, we'll try to get to as many of these as we can here in the time that we have left. Steve and Cindy have also agreed to have their contact information sent out with a brief follow-up email that will go out after the webinar. So if you do want to contact them directly with questions after the webinar, please feel free to do that. And again, their contact information will be shown here at the end of the webinar and will also be emailed out to everyone. So one of the questions that came up when we had our poll there on challenges that people encounter during their public processes. Several people actually were wondering about different strategies to overcome the challenge that I think many of us have encountered at public meetings, that being meetings that are dominated by one or a few people. Do you have any recommendations or strategies on how to overcome that challenge?
I would like to comment on that in particular, because I think one of the tendencies is to encourage 2 to 3 minute testimonies in order to make sure that everyone who wants to provide testimony has an opportunity to do so and has to keep it brief. And while that is one strategy that's often used to make sure not one person's dominating the meeting, at the same time it often leaves participants, especially in a heated or controversial situation, feeling like they haven't had a full chance to say what they need to say. And so this is where having a good qualified meeting facilitator really comes in handy, because there is a way to not only encourage participation from those people who have more to say, but also to make sure that you're not leaving anybody out because that one person is dominating. And part of it is just staying up front, that we have a limited time for the meeting here. We want to make sure that we hear from everyone. Because of the nature of the meeting, you will have to keep your comments limited. If you do have more to say, here are the other outreach techniques that we already have set up in place for you to share your thoughts. So if you're prepared at the meeting already to indicate that there are additional ways that they can respond and share commentary, right from the get-go, they know that this isn't their one chance to say what they need to say. But other than that, it's really about a strong facilitator or a meeting structure, again, that allows people to participate in different ways instead of just talking. One of the things we love to do, I mentioned sort of a trade-offs game, where you create sort of gaming pieces of information that they need to have about the project, and then have them either fill out worksheets or play the game, and the choices that they make through the game, which can be done on paper at a meeting, but also online, reflect their priorities. So again, it gives people a chance to share their priorities, but the meeting is structured in a way that you have control over how much time each person can spend in terms of sharing their feedback, but it also gives people an even footing to play the game or share their comments in a way that's different from an open panel discussion.
Great, thank you. And one here, another question, this probably gets to maybe that challenge of apathy. When you do have, say, not a whole lot of interest in a public process, in a specific project, you have only a small group of people, a small percentage of that community showing up. Do you have any recommendations on how to use that input, knowing that it's not likely representative of the entire community?
Well, first, I want to say that apathy is an issue everywhere, and it really isn't that people aren't interested. It's more of a factor of our busy lives. When we do recreation questionnaires and we ask why aren't you, more involved, or why don't you participate more frequently in different outdoor recreation activities, the first answer is because I'm just too busy. So we need to make sure we understand that it's not necessarily that people don't want to be involved, but sometimes that we have to provide other ways to allow them to participate. So like an online questionnaire, you can do that from the comfort of your own home. You don't have to attend a meeting or be available. So the first notion is to get ourselves outside of the thought that people have to attend a meeting in order to express their opinion. But the other comment was, what do you do when you only have feedback from a small group of people? And specifically, you have to make sure, again, that you're not taking that, anecdotal evidence and saying this reflects the entire community. But if possible, when you collect that information, also collect demographic information simultaneously when you're getting feedback in whatever outreach tool you're using, because that gives you a sense of who is responding, whether they're representing, formal interest groups, whether, maybe you ended up with 90% seniors responding to your question. Highly unlikely, but given our aging population, you want to make sure that you know that in terms of how you couch the results. Because the more you understand about who gave you those results, the better job you can do about figuring out how best to apply those results in your project.
Cindy mentioned intercept types of events too. I know with our Appalachian Forest Heritage Project, we went into rural West Virginia communities, and a lot of times, we wouldn't get much participation at first, but we try to figure out where we could best engage the community. So, we'd figure out where the community was. Sometimes it was going in through the churches. Sometimes it was a volunteer fire association. But we'd figure out where the strong sources of community were and try to engage those groups rather than waiting for them to come to us.
And it's always a good technique to go where the people are. If you have a festival that you know is going to be attended by 10,000 people in your community, you get your most talkative staff person out there to grab people as they go by and, have them comment. Maybe you have really nice graphic, visual, colorful, interactive display boards where they can use stickers to respond to different questions. So it's fun. You can craft questions so all ages can do it, so kids get involved. You can offer incentives for participation, prizes. There's a drawing, so everybody who participates in our intercept question feedback can leave their name and potentially win a drawing for a free night of camping at the local campground, or some other recreation opportunity that you provide. Free entry fee, or free, a day use pass or something of that nature. So there are different incentives. And what we find in reaching to other underrepresented groups too is some of the incentives that you need to provide, for example, to work really well with a Hispanic population, Not only language interpretation, but things like childcare make a difference. Maybe the reason that they can't come to meetings is because they feel like they can't bring their kids with them. And if you host a youth forum at the same time as you do your adult forum, right there, people have childcare, but it also gets their kids involved in saying what's important to them.
Great, and actually that kind of leads into this next question I have here, Cindy and Steve, and that is, do you have any ideas or insight on how you reach different race or ethnic groups, people that speak maybe different languages where English is not their first language, individuals with physical disabilities, or maybe groups that have barriers to participation?
Certainly, there's a variety of different ways, and just one that's at the top of my mind, again, thinking of Metro Parks Tacoma, because they recently created a Swan Creek Park Master Plan. It was a master plan for a 383-acre green space that had a historic context and had a very diverse community in that area. So their outreach efforts had to be, definitely varied. And what's interesting is they ended up with more than 1,400 people participating. And one of the ways they did that is they identified what those different ethnic groups were that they wanted to be involved, and they made sure that they had different forums to address it. So there was a Cambodian meeting, a Korean meeting, a Vietnamese meeting, where they found a volunteer who was willing to translate the questions and then the response, the feedback that they received from those different groups. They also went to different existing groups. There's a bike swap outreach, a global youth service day. They wanted to make sure that they had churches and homeowners associations and neighborhood groups involved. They wanted to make sure they reached out to the resource management fisheries people, the permaculture people. Again, they had all these little groups, often using, kept cost effective by using an intern to help coordinate all of this, but then also by using volunteers. There was a volunteer contact for these different groups that then could help identify who the participants should be and get them involved. And the question was specifically about barriers, but one of the things to realize is that sometimes the barrier is simply that you don't literally speak the same language as the participant, but more figuratively that you're not part of their in-group. Again, planners and government, to many people, there's this element of distrust. And so what you need to do is first identify who are those people who can be your intermediaries. Who are those people who can actually reach out to the community on your behalf, because the community is more likely to trust them. And then to address, getting people with different disabilities or abilities, one of the key things to realize is we often talk about disabilities in terms of mobility impairment. We think of ADA access and wheelchairs, for example. But really, as we have an aging population, one of the key things to remember is that the big disability that we're dealing with is often visual and hearing impairment. And, this sounds a little anecdotal, but you need to make sure that if you're having meetings, your materials are structured so that people can see them from across the room, recognizing that their eyesight may not be as good as yours, and that people can hear you adequately. And those are often, two minor things that we take for granted, but we need to be aware, again, of who the audience is that we're trying to reach and what their abilities and disabilities are, so we're reaching them in the best possible way.
Great. Another question here, and I think this is another one that many of us who are involved in public processes have likely faced at some point, and that is, how do you determine when you've done enough public outreach?
If I answer that question, I would say enough outreach means that your plan not only is successful in terms of adoption, but it's also successful in terms of implementation. So enough really, in part, it's the critical factor or the resources that you have. That if you don't have funding, you have to figure out how to maximize the funding you have to reach out to a variety of different people. But more feedback is better. And so if you still have, complaints coming in and you're concerned that people aren't on board, or in particular, that your board or council is not necessarily going to approve it because they feel that you haven't done sufficient public engagement, then that's an issue. So obviously more is needed. What it's usually safe to do is to look at your resources, identify what you can do that's slightly beyond that bare minimum. So you do what you need to do that's required, then you do what you think is needed in terms of getting the information to put the plan together. But then you leave resources, a contingency fund if necessary, for the end of the planning process as well, so that if for some reason you feel you don't have that critical mass of support to move forward, and again, not just for adoption, but also for implementation, that at that point you can double back with different groups to make sure you have different people on board, so that especially if your intent is to go out with some type of voter approved funding measure afterwards, you need to make sure in advance that you've done the right outreach to know that you have the positive support in place before you invest the resources to take that step.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I'm going to add on to this one a little based on another question that came in here. It kind of has to do with this whole question of doing enough versus doing the bare minimum. Are there ways to help convince agencies, local jurisdictions to go beyond the bare minimums that are required in a public participation process? Any recommendations to get them to go above and beyond what may be required by law or by regulation?
I would say one of the critical comments that seems to appeal to agency directors in particular, also your council and your board, is when you talk about things in terms of financial terms. They always want to make sure their money is well invested, and part of their concern is they don't want to spend a lot of money on outreach if that's not needed. So one of the key things to again, messaging to use to convince them that more outreach is valuable is to talk about it in terms of a return on investment. So when you talk to them, for example, about if we have these types of techniques and can point out that they reach these types of groups, and also point out where those groups are willing to support again, plan adoption, but also implementation, whether they're your business groups that you're reaching out to, whether they're volunteer groups, etc. It's finding a way to convince them that there's more of a value to simply doing the public involvement than talking to people and gathering information for your planning process. The value is the long-term investment that then voters, business groups, and others will put back into your recreation resource in the long term.
Yeah, I put it in the phrase of more bang for the buck. I mean, if you can show that X amount of participation led to X number of volunteer hours that were generated by community members, that's something that's going to speak to elected officials and agency managers. So I think you got to put it in those return on investment language that Cindy mentioned.
Yeah, and that's a real good point there, Steve, in terms of bang for your buck. And there's been a couple of questions or comments related to kind of the costs involved with public participation processes. And are there ways to make that affordable and more efficient from a cost basis that you could recommend?
From a cost basis, meetings tend to be pretty expensive in terms of staff time, the setup time, creating materials, copying materials for everyone. So part of it, again, is looking at technology, if that is available to you, recognizing that instead of paper surveys, online surveys tend to be far more cost effective and reach far more people. Looking at, instead of your traditional meetings, maybe just setting up a booth that you can take to a variety of different locations that someone else, including volunteers, can run for you. And especially the new trend towards the do-it-yourself meetings, where you create the materials that are necessary. Maybe it's a page that summarizes what the key issues are of the project, then something that provides talking points for who's ever leading the meeting to talk through what these issues are and collect feedback, and then some type of comment card or, again, interactive voting exercise or something of that nature to collect feedback, then somebody else is actually doing the outreach for you and reporting the results back to you. But the key thing is just broadening who's doing it. It doesn't, obviously there needs to be some staff oversight, but if you have a park and recreation board, get your board members being responsible liaisons to the community so that they're investing their time rather than paid staff time taking care of all the details. Identify who those community leaders are who can connect and start organizing the different groups, getting people scheduled, because a lot of meeting scheduling and inviting people is the time around doing that. So it's finding ways to delegate the responsibility to others where possible and where that's effective.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned the do-it-yourself meetings. Those seem a really interesting way to kind of delegate those responsibilities and get more people involved in that public participation process. Are there other tools that you would recommend that are available now that someone could get online and learn more about?
Well,
I think there.
Okay.
Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just going to mention, with the Forest Service implementing their new planning rules, some of the pilot forests that are implementing that have really used some very interesting virtual planning. I'm thinking of the Sierra National Forest. They have a virtual planning site that's called Our Forest Home, and basically an online community, a planning community where people can post ideas and an online virtual dialogue that I really like. So that would be a really good example of a new technique like that.
And it's amazing how much information you can find when you go online. So for example, if you type in your Google National Park Service Civic Engagement, you'll find the website that they have that provides not only different resources, they have manuals put together. There's one called Stronger Together, a manual on principles and practices of civic engagement. There's one on leading in a collaborative environment that presents case studies on collaboration and civic engagement. They have a list of tools, and really it's at www.mps.gov/civic. So there's that information, plus if you go to the International Association of Public Participation, they have a variety of tools listed there. The shorthand is IAP2. And it's amazing how much information you can get there. Obviously, in the book we just prepared, the chapter has a matrix that has a full list of tools and forums that you can use, ranging from meetings and questionnaires, surveys, outreach events, and forums to other tools. I mean, looking at things like ballot measures is a way to reach out to the public, and ambassadors kits that you can use, as well as a variety of different notification methods. It's amazing how many things are out there, and some of them are very formal. I mean, there's tools called like a citizens jury, which is an assembled group of 12 to 20 randomly selected people, again selected to represent a microcosm of their community. They meet over several days. They focus on a specific policy question to reach consensus and a decision. So some are very formal, but some are very informal, such as going to different gathering places, go to the coffee shop, and putting up a flyer to announce the planning process and to announce your online questionnaire, for example, to get feedback.
Great, thank you. We have time. I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions here before we wrap up for the day. Again, Cindy and Steve have agreed to have their contact information sent out, and we'll provide it here on one of the next slides also for anyone who does have a follow-up question for either one of them. Let's see here. We got a question. Earlier you mentioned kind of a history of distrust. Distrust was a sign that collaboration wasn't the best approach. And this person is asking, well, can't collaboration help build trust? Can you address kind of that challenge there, that difference, that you know, if collaboration is not the best approach, but collaboration helps build trust, how do you bridge that?
Well, I guess my experience with that is that when people are not, you know, looking across the table at each other and they're talking to other people that tend to agree with them, that tends to build barriers and walls between groups and between individuals and your managing authorities. So the more you can create forums, you know, in person where people actually are talking to other people that may or may not agree with them, that's where you really see the real benefits from a more collaborative process. When people have to actually talk and share information, at first they may disagree on the veracity of the information. Everybody seems to have their own source of truthful information, but that's where you really start to see the real benefits from a collaborative process.
And if I can add to that, if you go back to that IAP2 framework, you know, there is a history of distrust among residents in general. And so you want to make sure you're using the right tools to inform, consult, and involve. But when it comes to true collaboration, those people are your partners in decision making. If you have too many partners who don't trust you or your agency, that project is not going to move forward. It will grind to a halt. So in terms of true collaboration where you're working with other jurisdictions, etc., you need to be sure that these are people that you feel you can work with. And if not, again, involve them in a different way. Make sure that their voice is heard, but don't put them in a position of authority that can completely halt your project from going forward.
Definitely. And I'm going to get to one last one here, not so much a question as it is a comment for all of us today, though maybe you have some specific examples from your case studies or other experiences. Comment here about thinking more broadly when it comes to putting together your stakeholder groups. In particular, as an example of local agencies, say, looking more broadly to include state and federal agencies on their public outreach list, and I'd say vice versa, state and federal agencies when they're going through their processes of collaborating with local agencies. Anything in your experience, Cindy or Steve, related to that of taking a more broad approach to how you put together that list of stakeholders?
Well, you need to make sure that the right people are at the table. And so obviously if you've got a powerhouse, National Park Service, other federal agency, state agency, you don't want to leave them out of the planning process. So it's obviously important to again, make sure they're represented. But what we run into, again, realistically, I'm thinking of a project in particular where we wanted to talk to state parks. The most obvious contact in terms of trails and recreation resource development said, well, I can't say a word till I get permission from my boss, who then needed permission from their boss. So there is a chain of command that you have to follow. So often you need to make sure that you find out who's at the top of that chain of command. Be ready to make a pitch on why their involvement is so important or critical to your planning process, and then tell them that you've heard that so-and-so person may be the best in terms of working, but let them choose what person from their organization will actually represent them.
I think my comment on that too would be that most planning process these days for a discrete resource area is taking a more a landscape context to that, just because there are so many processes, whether it's upstream runoff or air pollution that affects the management of that resource area, that it's real important that you figure out how to engage those authorities and stakeholder groups that may be physically located outside the boundaries of your resource area, but it's important to engage them in the process. I have even an example. We have a university forest here that our division manages at West Virginia University, And there's one part of the forest right now that the forest manager recommends that no one go near because there's a irate landowner, an adjacent landowner that perhaps isn't going to be happy if you come in and work on your research project there. So clearly, in our planning efforts, we need to engage those adjacent landowners in our planning efforts.
When it comes to other agencies, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be sitting at the table or on your advisory board. It may just be sharing information, that you establish a contact there to make sure that you know of the research that they've already done. They have a way to contact you if something comes up that they feel they need to comment on, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily have to have somebody sitting there at the table of every single meeting through your planning process.
Excellent. Yes, very good point. With that, I think we're going to wrap up our question and answer session. I know I wasn't able to get to everyone's questions. Again, if you do have some specific follow-ups, Steve and Cindy's contact information will be provided here. Also, we got several questions about the availability of the PowerPoint. Just to remind everyone, the PowerPoint will be available on the SORP website shortly. We'll also have the recorded version posted on YouTube later, and we'll make sure that an announcement goes out to let everyone know when those are available. Before we wrap up today, I do want to point everyone to some additional SORP resources. The SORP website is a great place to find lots and lots of planning-related resources. In particular, I direct you to the resources area of our website. We do have links to various tools and documents that may help you in your planning efforts. You may not be aware, but each year we do host the National Outdoor Recreation Conference. Next year's conference is in San Francisco, California, May 13th through the 16th. Our conference does provide an exceptional mix of learning and networking opportunities for outdoor recreation professionals. I hope you consider joining us in San Francisco in May. And finally, I mentioned this at the top of the webinar. We've mentioned a couple other times. During the webinar, the Best Practices in Outdoor Recreation Planning book will be out later this year and provides an outstanding collection of best practices for all your outdoor recreation planning efforts. There will also be several additional webinars coming up here in the future that track pretty closely with the chapters of that book, so stay tuned for those. And one last thing here, if you're not a member, I do highly recommend you become one today. I do my job as president here to encourage membership. As an organization focused on outdoor recreation, we're committed to advancing educational and professional development opportunities, including things like this webinar and our annual conference, developing and voicing a united position on outdoor recreation issues and concerns, promoting scholarship and advancement for students and young professionals, and providing our members with the latest resources and networking opportunities. We do a lot of that through our website, our weekly emails, and then again our annual conference. In conclusion here, I really want to thank Cindy and Steve today for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise and experience with collaboration and public participation. This type of information sharing is a critical component of the SORP mission. It wouldn't be possible without their willingness to share and enthusiasm for planning in the great outdoors. So thank you both. And to our participants, thank you. I hope this webinar was informative and provided you with additional information that you can use in your jobs. As I mentioned before, you'll be receiving a post-webinar email that includes a link to a short survey. Your participation in this survey is greatly appreciated and will help us organize future webinars. So thank you in advance for taking a few minutes to complete the survey. You'll see now up on the screen there Cindy and Steve's contact information along with mine. So if you do have follow-up questions, please feel free to contact them directly. Their contact information will also be in that follow-up email that contains the survey link. With that, I'm going to close our webinar here today. Thank you again to our speakers and everyone who participated. Have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you all on our next SORP webinar. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.